before we talk about the applications from an industry standpoint, anything that you can share in terms of the impact of the work at MetLife, in terms of the results? Everyone wants to know, hey, what were the results? Was there any impact? Did you grow?
We had tremendous success, Jeffrey. The insurance industry sort of measures growth by premium growth, which is really a proxy for how many people are getting policies, right? And we tripled our premium in less than 2 years.
Wow.
And a significant percentage of our policies were acquired by African American, Hispanic, and Asian American customers, which we saw as a validation of our approach. And we did that, Jeffrey, without spending any money in the specific verticals. So we did not buy, Spanish language television or Spanish language media, other than as part of our overall kind of media buy. And so we didn't have a special effort. We didn't have a, specific agency just going after those markets. We went after a broader population with a message that appealed across all of these segments, that was relevant to all of these segments, with truly sort of mass market media. Now, a lot of it was digital and a lot of it was television, because those two platforms work really well for these products.
The big question: how quickly can brands and businesses change and modernize in response to the changing demographics globally? The future of work, demand for modernizing the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and industry corrections. This is why we started the Change Podcast by Reframe, to help people leaders like you get answers that accelerate inclusive change and growth that reflects where the world is going. Get ready as we host a discussion with people leaders faced with the same challenges and modernize their approach to solving a decades-old problem. I'm your host, Jeffrey L. Bowman. Episode 5, Good Trouble, Validating the Total Market Approach. In this episode, I speak with former client and Senior Vice President of Marketing at MetLife, Lewis Goldman. Lewis is a seasoned marketing professional with over 35 years of experience, particularly in cross-cultural marketing and financial services. We discuss his journey from consumer packaged goods to the financial sector, the challenges of marketing life insurance, and the importance of understanding underserved markets. The conversation highlights innovative product development for diverse communities and the critical role of family in life insurance marketing. We highlight the success of the total market approach that he and I worked on. It focuses on cultural connections that go beyond race, ethnicity, and identity. The discussion also touches on the industry's resistance to change and the need for brands to adapt a more inclusive marketing approach that reflects the society in which we live in today. I'm excited to dig in and share our story.
Today, we're going to be joined by Lewis Goldman. Lewis is a former client. We've known each other for many years. And I have to say, he was really one of the first brands, and he will share a little bit about his background. But one of the first brands to really jump in and support not only the work that we were doing as it relates to Ogilvy and Ogilvy culture, but we continue to stay in touch over the years. A lot of the foundational stuff that you will see in Reframe the Marketplace, the total market approach to the new majority, started with an engagement with MetLife. Why don't you share the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. And I'm very excited to be joining you today for this. I've been involved in marketing for over 35 years. Don't really want to disclose how many because it'll date me. With a primary focus on digital and e-commerce going back into the 90s. I worked across industries, financial services, retail, services, different types of businesses. And I've been particularly fascinated by cross-cultural marketing, going back to one of my first jobs, which was at Colgate-Palmolive, where I was in charge of Hispanic marketing for Palmolive dishwashing liquid. We actually invested quite heavily in Spanish language media because of the high incidence of Hispanic people who use Palmolive dishwashing liquid. It accounted for about 25% of our sales. So it's something I've been really interested in, and I'm excited to talk to you about our shared experience when I was at MetLife.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I never really knew about your experience at Colgate Palmolive. And, for, those new to the season, these episodes that we featured, it's really about revisionist history. This year will be 10 years since the publishing of Reframe the Marketplace. And it was really a launching pad for Reframe consulting services. You may have heard or may not have heard in the other episodes in terms of how I left Ogilvy in 2015 after a 3-year run of Ogilvy culture. And Ogilvy culture was, one of the first inclusive customer experience design practices within marketing and communications. And so oftentimes when we were out pitching brands, there was always something personal, deeply personal to the person we were pitching as to why they chose us. And your background that you just shared with regards to Hispanic marketing, is that thing, that indicator, meaning you had previous experience, you understood because of the work that you had done, you understood about the opportunity and the growth from a demographic standpoint. Can you just, given that you had that experience at Colgate Palmolive, can you just, for some of our listeners, they may be new to this topic of conversation, and naturally they just assume like, hey, brands went after not only general market, they went after multicultural consumers as well. And that always wasn't the case. From a foundational standpoint, what did you learn from some of those early experiences in targeting the U.S. Hispanic market?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to give you some context, Palmolive dishwashing liquid, even back when I was doing this, and this, by the way, was in the late 80s, was a brand that was available across a whole variety of Latin American markets. And as a result, it was a brand that had brand equity among Hispanic consumers who emigrated to the United States. Because of that, there was an affinity and a connection with the brand that resulted in them way over-indexing in terms of buying Palmolive versus other dishwashing liquids. And in recognition of that, we realized that tapping into this market, which was growing back then, of course, now it's truly exploded, would be an opportunity to grow the brand, especially against Procter & Gamble company, brands such as Ivory and others, Dawn, that were spending more than we were in the market. So we actually decided we wanted to become the number one player in the Hispanic market. We actually hired a leading Hispanic celebrity. Her name was Charitín, and she did commercials with, for those old enough to remember, Madge, who was our spokesperson for Palmolive dishwashing liquid for probably 40 years.
Wow.
And so they did commercials together. The commercials were in Spanish. Sometimes Madge would speak in English. And we ran, I think, a solid 20 or 25% of our budget against Spanish language media to support that. So in that case, it came organically out of the environment and out of the nature of the business. And the fact that so many of our customers already had an affinity for the brand, and something we thought we could own and build on.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And at that time, that was the thinking. As I know you've covered in your book, that was the thinking. You go after the Hispanic market with Spanish language media. You go after the African American market and African American media channels. You go after the Asian American market through, various channels and tailored to them.
Well, so, you having that background and context, I think, one of the other brands that we had the pleasure of serving was British Airways. And, the lead at that particular time, he had come from Ogilvy and he was the vice president of marketing, but there was always someone else on his team, and she had biracial children. And that was like her personal thing that she brought to the table in terms of wanting to see the world a little bit different, but also wanting to see how you went to market and got a better understanding and insights. And so you were already bringing your experience with the multicultural audiences based on the previous job you had from a brand perspective. So always something new, nuance with regards to the early beginnings. And so I can add that as another story as to why the folks like yourself who understood the opportunity without necessarily having to see it in front of them. And so So let's talk about MetLife and your time there.
Sure.
How did you make the pivot? I mean, you went from CPG to financial services. What experience like for you?
Well, I a long history of working in financial services and particularly in e-commerce. And I think that was attractive to MetLife. When I was hired by MetLife in 2013, they were really looking for someone who was not from the insurance industry because they felt there was a bit of groupthink going on in the insurance industry, which is, by the way, a very sort of self-contained, somewhat incestuous industry. In terms of, people moving from company to company and really only respecting people who have insurance industry experience, because I'm still working in the industry today. So they liked that outsider's perspective.
Yeah.
They liked the fact that I was a mass marketer.
Yep.
The vast majority of insurance marketers were either brand marketers or they were B2B marketers to try to get agents to sell their product because the agent channel accounted for 80% plus of all life insurance sales. So I think they liked the consumer marketing, the digital marketing, the fact I was coming from outside the industry, but the fact that I had deep financial services experience, which meant that I understood what it was like to work in a highly regulated industry in terms of what you can and can't say. So I think that was the combination that made it fit.
Yeah, and like I shared in the book, it was interesting when we were asked internally at Ogilvy, I think you guys were looking for innovative ideas in terms of how to grow the number of policies, but also I think you had just landed within MetLife as well. And one of the things that, death is an equal opportunity.
That is very true. And it's inevitable for all of us.
It's inevitable, right? There's nothing involved. Like everyone is going to die. It's just a matter of when, not if. And so, when we begin to think about life insurance, that could be interesting because, for context wise, what was going on at Ogilvy is like we were looking for brands that our quote unquote account teams were already servicing. We were not looking to go pitch new businesses for this innovative approach. And it's hard to explain because at the time, everyone was so entrenched in terms of Ogilvy being a general market agency and not necessarily being at the time, quote unquote, a multicultural offering or providing multicultural offerings. And so the idea of cross-cultural was a positioning opportunity, not only for the agency, but it was just the right thing to do in terms of how we would approach. But what we also knew that it had to be a phased approach in terms of how we got to the opportunity and the solve. And so that was, for context wise, I think we had an opportunity with IKEA on the retail side. And so when we approached you guys, I think there was some openness, but, you guys wanted us to come and share a little bit about the practice in itself with regards to Ogilvy culture. For context wise, what were you thinking initially when we approached you guys about this new offering in itself?
Well, that's a great question, Jeffrey. I think you did a great job of talking about some of the challenges in marketing life insurance in your opening of your book, where you talk about, this is a product that the individual who gets it never gets to use, has to pay in it for over, 15, 20, 30 years every month, and also has to, by getting the product, confront their own mortality, which none of us really want to do.
Yeah.
So it makes it a real challenge from a marketing perspective. One of the things that I am passionate about is focusing on products or services that are something that's important for people, but that aren't getting the kind of household penetration that they should be. And one of the things that really intrigued me about MetLife and life insurance is life insurance has been in literally about a 50-year decline, Jeffrey.
Wow.
The penetration of life insurance in U.S. households right now is at the lowest mark over probably the last 60 years. It's, I think, around 42, 43%. And if you've ever spoken with someone who's been impacted by the premature death of a parent or a caregiver, you will know that in addition to obviously the wrenching emotional toll that takes, there's also a tremendous financial toll. A person who worked on my team who is head of sales had his father pass away when he was a teenager. And fortunately, his father had life insurance, and that life insurance enabled him. His mother, by the way, was a homemaker, was not working. And fortunately, that life insurance enabled him to go to college and to have the career they ended up having. If his father had not had life insurance, he would have probably not gone to college. He would have had to find a job to help support his family, because he did not grow up from, a rich family in any shape, way, shape, or form. So it was very personal to him.
Yeah.
And the problem is that because of the way life insurance is sold, because of its complexity, because of the fact that it is a product that people don't really want to get, but know they need, it makes it a difficult product to sell. And the industry hasn't been helpful because the process of getting approved and priced for life insurance is really quite onerous. You're talking about basically an hour's worth of questions, and some of them very personal and some of them very specific about various medical conditions. So it's not a process that lends itself to an easy sell. The underwriting process takes several months usually. It usually involves some kind of an exam. Now, the industry has gotten better with using data and automated underwriting, but one of the gaps that the industry has had over that time period is, as bad as penetration is with the broader market, it was particularly bad with certain various ethnic markets. And that had to do with a lack of agents. Again, agents were the predominant and still are the predominant distribution vehicle for life insurance, but a lack of agents in African American communities, in Asian American communities, in Hispanic communities, the lack of agents who speak Spanish or speak Mandarin or Cantonese for various Indo-Chinese markets. So this underserved element meant there was an even greater opportunity and greater need to help, those underserved segments. And the whole premise of MetLife was we were going to democratize life insurance by selling it directly to consumers, predominantly through the internet, but also through phone centers, call centers. And so to do that, we wanted to reach a much wider market and go after some of these underserved segments that were frankly, it was less competition, but also probably in some ways an even bigger need based on some of the, some of the nature of the income and wealth distribution of those markets relative to, kind of the mass market.
No, I love the way you set that up. I think a couple of things too for me is to, once we started like uncovering, the opportunity in itself in terms of impact, what was surprising in working within the category was that oftentimes insurance companies didn't allocate a lot of resources to households that were less than, $100,000.
Yeah.
And so, for me, on a personal standpoint, I remember Mr. Jimmy coming to knock on our door, and he had like this long sheet, and it would be the payment history of my grandmother, because she would, pay $8 or whatever a month, and she would have $1,000 term policy, right? And so I always saw that as, although I got to know the agent, but if she missed a payment, then that, the policy goes away. And she had been paying all those years. And so when we began to unlock, what the category was not doing, and considering the fact that everybody dies, how could we not use this as an opportunity to be more inclusive in terms of the experience and while growing a share of the pie, specifically at the $99,000 and below. And so what that experience with MetLife taught us was that most companies, regardless of their size, didn't have primary data for Black, Hispanic, and Asian. And what do we mean by that? We started with the sizing, size of the prize as our first deliverable with you guys. I thought that, maybe it was category specific, but as we've continued to do the work, most companies don't have that primary data in terms of the value those audience segments represent. Any thoughts or remarks as it relates to why most companies probably don't have that information within their walls?
I think it's a function of, and I'm just going to talk about life insurance, Jeffrey, rather than broaden it to other industries. For life insurance, because it is a wholesale sale, they're just a lot less sophisticated in general about marketing data than a more direct-to-consumer type of company. So I would say that we did a lot of research, both with you and with third parties, to understand the market, okay, and to understand the various segments of the market. That's where we identified a underpenetration of life insurance in the Hispanic and African American markets, and to a lesser extent in the Asian American markets. And that's where we identified that as an opportunity. Part of it was also finding products that would resonate not just with those markets, but that could be sold on a direct-to-consumer basis, especially through the internet.
So innovation.
So what you wanted to, sorry?
There's opportunity for innovation.
Exactly. So we created 3 new products specifically for MetLife Direct. One is called a guaranteed issue whole life product, which is also known in the industry as a final expense product, to cover the cost of funeral and end-of-life expenses. That is a much smaller amount of money than a typical term policy. Those policies are generally $20,000 to $30,000 in terms of payout. But you don't have to go through any underwriting. You basically are guaranteed. You fill it out and you pay for it and you get it. So it can be done, basically in about a 10-minute online application process, or over the phone in 10 or 15 minutes. That product is a product that actually does very well with certain communities that's very important to. And so that was a product that we designed specifically for the African American and Hispanic markets, because we found, based on our research, that having a robust funeral and the ability to say goodbye and show that this was a life well lived was very important to that market. So we not only did looked at data, but we also did a lot of qualitative and other type of research to really understand the mindset of these various segments. We also introduced a simplified issue term product, which was what we refer to as light underwriting. We check a few things. We check for pre-existing conditions, but there you can get up to $250,000 in coverage. It's a great product for younger people starting out in their career, because it will cover their financial needs if something was to happen to them prematurely. And then, we also had our traditional term product, which we modified for this market, for the direct business, where you could get up to $2 million in coverage. And that's the sort of a comprehensive life insurance coverage that we first think of. You mentioned earlier, Jeffrey, about the fact that you have that coverage for a period of time and then goes away. That is somewhat deliberate. I mean, you can get a full life policy, it costs a lot more money, and then has value at the end. But the point of term life insurance, and the point of really all life insurance that's covering your earning years, is to basically replace or cover. It's really a financial analysis.
Exactly.
It's saying, okay, normally I'd be working for 10 or 15 more years. I've got to put a kid through college. So these are kind of my expenses. So I need coverage for this amount if I'm not here.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I'm basically replacing the earnings that I would have. Now, at the age I am now, where all my kids are out of the house, they've all finished the education that at least I'm going to pay for.
God bless you.
Thank you. I no longer have a need for term life insurance, and my term life insurance policy will expire in a few years.
Right.
Because now I'm at an age where, my retirement income and saving, or my retirement savings and stuff will start to kick in, although I plan to work for a number of years. So this is, an important thing to consider, that it's really to replace earnings rather than to, kind of just be a big, lottery type payout to your kids or to your loved ones.
No, I appreciate that. And I think for those who are not as educated in terms of the role that life insurance plays in your life stages, I think you really laid it out in terms of the value. And I think for, we'll make it a little bit broader for the audience. Again, we were, as we say in the book, we were pretty much in the formative stages of developing our framework. You, as well as others in the leadership team within MetLife, you guys took a chance on us. And so one of the things that came out is that we had another validation point of a framework for how to build inclusive customer experiences. And you've articulated, meaning that we did the sizing piece, multiple billions of dollars at stake from a category standpoint by going below the $100,000 of income. And then we came back in partnership with you guys. You guys gave us a lot of data with our data analytics team We did the size of the price for each of those different audience segments. Then we got alignment, meaning that's when a light bulb went off, when everyone could see the financial opportunity. But then it was left with another challenge, meaning, okay, now we know the value from a volumetric standpoint. How do we get to the insights in terms of the people? And you just laid that out in terms of, we went through developing personas, and we developed a segmentation, and then you guys went as far as doing the testing in terms of what we call brand drivers research. So you guys really made the investment in terms of not only just understanding the opportunity, but we went on a journey together to where now we were actually redesigning the products, thinking about innovative opportunities as it relates to product that didn't necessarily exist. And so I didn't want that to be underscored, that there's an investment level that you have to make before you see the financial piece. And you're going to uncover gaps within your organization. And once we were able to get through that, I think one of the more interesting things that came out, specifically with life insurance, the role of family and how we, I think there was a New York Times piece that came out at that particular time that talked about the redefinition of family. And family plays a huge part of life insurance in itself because of loved ones. You're presenting this thing that you didn't know that you needed to a group of people that wants to care for their loved ones. And so that all fed the creative process, and meaning, the role of family. Did you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of what that meant to the experience?
Yeah, and I just want to mention one thing about the under 100,000 income market. It was referred to at the time as the middle market. It's also referred to as the mass market. There had been a number of companies, particularly led by Swiss Re, talking about that as a real opportunity, that the penetration of life insurance was particularly low for that. If you think about it, wealthy individuals have life insurance because it's more an investment product for them than it is necessarily a protection product. So the people who needed kind of life insurance the most were those people who make $100,000 or less, because those are the ones who are living sort of paycheck to paycheck and need that to cover that missed earnings that would happen from somebody passing away.
Once we got through the insights piece, we then began to get into the creative. And part of that insight was, the hero of the family and the redefinition of what family meant at that particular time, because, I think it was the beginning of marketing to, millennials we were coming out of the financial crisis, millennials in terms of what they were doing different for Gen X. And so there was a lot of shifting in terms of the demographics. People were moving from urban centers to rural. And so one of the piece there was the redefinition of family and what that meant. Yeah. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that for a second, and then we'll keep moving forward.
Sure. So, and I want to just caveat this by saying, I don't want to overgeneralize about a particular ethnic group. This was insights that we found that there were a over-indexing of the things that I'm about to describe. So one of the commonalities that we found across the Hispanic, African-American, Asian-American communities was the importance of family. Okay. Now, the family dynamics are a little bit different market to market. In the African-American market, we found a predominance of the woman head of household being a key sort of person in terms of the decisions that the family were making, particularly in terms of financial decisions. There was an over-indexing of single female head of households. And there was also not an incidence, but a higher incidence of multi-generational households. So that actually was a commonality between African-American households. And then there was also somewhat of an overlap in Hispanic households, where there's tremendous respect, again, for the woman head of household. In the Asian American market, it was much more common to have multi-generational households. They're taking care of their parents as well as taking care of their kids. So all of this, though, revolved around a focus on the matriarch of the household. And we thought that there was a common thread there that we could build off of. That's one of the reasons why, the total market approach resonated so much, for us in terms of marketing. Because, while There are different ethnic groups, and there are a lot of differences between cultures and environments and priorities, et cetera. There was this commonality of kind of the importance of family and the importance of the matriarch in the family and the matriarch making decisions like this. And so as a result, we saw that as sort of the hook that could be used to be able to make life insurance more palatable, more acceptable, and something that they would consider because of its importance in protecting the family.
Yeah, no, I like the way that you framed that up because, and it's really hard to describe, of what that meant from a validation standpoint as it relates to the cross-cultural platform. And, for many brands at that particular time, they would separate their general market insights or mass from their multicultural insights. And, at that particular time, I think we maybe had 2 or 3 engagements. 2010, we introduced this thinking through the cross-cultural report at the Association of National Advertisers Multicultural Conference as a piece of thought leadership, meaning we hadn't had any clients yet. And so we get all the way to 2013, we were trending at about 2 to 3 clients a year. And for you and the leadership team there at that particular time, we call it the go around the circle, meaning our 6 steps. That meant that there had to be an investment made. And oftentimes what we were seeing at that particular time is that internally, meaning from the inside, brands were not actually making the investment on sizing the value, sizing the opportunity. They were basically developing a general market idea. And then the other agencies, Hispanic, Black, or Asian, then would interpret that idea as to what that meant for, or how it could be executed for the Black audience, for the Hispanic audience, for the Asian audience. And so the fact that you guys actually did the work, not only in sizing the opportunity, but also insights from gleaning standpoint, helped us get to a framework as to a cross-cultural platform from overall positioning, meaning what were those commonalities as it relates to the opportunity and the insight, and then what were specific to each of those different audiences. And so I love the way that you were able to remember, number one, because it's been, almost over 10 years. And so that played a huge part in terms of validating, and now gave us at Ogilvy Culture at the time the opportunity to say to the industry, yes, it can be done, and here's how it looks, and here's how it works. We obviously took it on to a creative execution. Before we talk about the applications from an industry standpoint, anything that you can share in terms of the impact of the work at MetLife, in terms of the results? Everyone wants to know, hey, what were the results? Was there any impact? Did you grow?
We had tremendous success, Jeffrey. The insurance industry sort of measures growth by premium growth, which is really a proxy for how many people are getting policies, right? And we tripled our premium in less than 2 years.
Wow.
And a significant percentage of our policies were acquired by African American, Hispanic, and Asian American customers, which we saw as a validation of our approach. And we did that, Jeffrey, without spending any money in the specific verticals. So we did not buy, Spanish language television or Spanish language media, other than as part of our overall kind of media buy. And so we didn't have a special effort. We didn't have a specific agency just going after those markets. We went after a broader population with a message that appealed across all of these segments, that was relevant to all of these segments, with truly sort of mass market media. Now, a lot of it was digital and a lot of it was television, because those 2 platforms work really well for these products. In the case of television, it was for the final expense product, which tended to skew older. And at that point, older people were still watching television. I guess they still are. But, there was the growth of the streaming services hadn't occurred yet. Yeah. So linear television was a more viable channel for us. And then digital channels were great for a simplified issue term, as well as our full term product. So we're able to grow and over-index against those segments, I think, through the messaging rather than through the media selection process.
Hey, Lewis, that's really disruptive in terms of what you just said. And, it's interesting because for me, I was actually coming from the brand side to Ogilvy, and a lot of the work that we were documenting and reframe the marketplace was really about, an ambition of mine was modernizing the practice of marketing and communications, not just modernizing the practice of general market, not just modernizing the practice of multicultural, but really, brand showed up for the total addressable audience using a different approach from an insights perspective. And so, in 2010, nothing but like a piece of thought leadership, we introduced it, told the industry that, hey, here's what we're about to do. And for some reason, the Association of National Advertisers put us within the multicultural conference track. And we were fine with it, but really we wanted to pursue the ANA Masters track, which is where a lot of the CMOs went. Didn't come back until, after we came back and talked about, hey, look at the evidence. It actually works. And so from 2010 to probably 2013, 14, you had other companies attempting the total market approach that really didn't have the discipline to develop a framework in terms of how do you operationalize it. And so what a lot of people didn't know industry-wise was that it was a piece of thinking at the time, and it really wasn't a there, meaning that we had to go out, get clients the old-fashioned way, develop an hypothesis in terms of how do you begin to operationalize it. I had a lot of corporate strategy experience from my previous experiences, so I knew how the brand planning process worked. So that was like my superpower in terms of adding to it. And so when we got to you guys, willingness to go through the process oftentimes takes a lot of discipline because brands are under pressure, CMOs under pressure. I still think the average tenure is still between 24 and 36 months. And to do something like this does require 12 to 18 months of work within the organization, because for the first time in the history of your brand, you're actually bringing a lot of that stuff in-house in terms of the insights and gleanings. And so to hear the impact and results was a significant milestone, not only just for MetLife, but for the financial services industry, but also for us in the marketing communications industry. And so when we went back, to the Association of National Advertisers, and that is the industry association for advertisers, it's the largest, we were not really met with open arms. And part of it is because of...
Very true. I've been at the meeting.
Yeah. Part of it is because of what you just laid out, right? Meaning that you could widen the aperture based on insights and drive a significant value from a business standpoint by doing some very non-traditional things. And what that does sometimes, specific to the category, now this is not applicable to all industry verticals, this is specific to this case, you are able to drive impact by innovation, meaning new products, because you had a better understanding. And that was an efficiency play that was very effective, that drove significant volume increase in terms of policies. And so when I went back to the Association for National Advertisers and said, ta-da, look, it works, not met with a lot of enthusiasm, they invited me to, again, the ANA multicultural track at that particular time, to their committee to say, hey, we understand what you've done from 2010. Now it's a few years past. Prove it that it works. And then I said, I will. I got a client. We just went through it. And so, and this is laid out in the book as well. We went to a committee meeting. I think it was in Chicago.
I believe you're right. Yes.
It was in Chicago. And, for some people new to the conversation, we went before their committee. And it was really about, defining what total market meant, right? Defining how do you operationalize it. and then having proof or validation that it actually drives impact. And for context, and this is a historical piece, when the Association of National Advertisers, which is responsible for educating and providing education to its members, they formed in the 1930s in partnership with the 4As, which is the Industry Association for Agencies. And then they formed the Advertising Research Foundation. And so from the 1930s all the way up until 1999, 2000, they didn't have a multicultural track. So the comeback, less than, let's say 15 years, it took them, 60 years to develop track for multicultural with a whole new thing that was disruptive, meaning general market, multicultural. Total market meant that you would have to consolidate one or the other, general market, multicultural, because now you had a total market approach that was inclusive of all segments. And so, I asked Lewis, I said, Lewis, I don't think we're going to be walking into friendly territory. And, would you be willing to come down the foxhole with me? And I don't think we knew what we were walking into at that particular time, because I didn't see this as a threat, to be frank with you. I thought it would be perceived as an opportunity to modernize a whole practice in terms of marketing communications. I mean, what was your view when I asked you, and then when we finally got there, how did you find the experience?
Yeah, so I also didn't know walking in there what we were walking into, but in retrospect, I understand why the pushback was so strong, and it was strong. You were walking into a room of people who had a vested interest in the status quo, Jeffrey. There are agencies that focus on specific ethnic markets, and that is their reason for being, and that is how they, make a living. And so they were threatened because now all of a sudden general mass market, or the bigger agencies could now do all of it, and they didn't have to split, a percentage of the media spend with, a Hispanic agency, an agency focused on the African American community, another agency focused on the Asian American community. And then you also had people at the companies themselves who might be focused on a specific market or specific markets as part of their job. So, we were threatening, what the industry had moved to over the last, 15 or 20 years. So it went from ignoring multicultural to making multicultural kind of a big thing, and basically market segmentation, and then looking at the market through a very tunnel vision lens of just, this particular part of the market or that particular part of the market. Now, all of a sudden we were saying, hey, we want to go back to essentially the way that it was, but just with a different mindset and a different approach. And that was very threatening to, I think, a lot of people in the room, especially a room full of quote unquote multicultural marketers, which was the meeting that we were in, Jeffrey. I think that our presentation would have been better received if we were in, the more general committees of the ANA rather than the multicultural committee.
Yeah, I think you definitely hit it spot on. And I really didn't understand. And again, I like you, I came from the brand side. I understand, risk averse environment that's often associated with any type of brand planning. And given the macro events, for the first time in human history, minorities were becoming the majority. We walked into that room, and I think you had another point of view in terms of what total market meant, and how the ANA as an industry association wanted to address this tension, meaning that the multicultural track, conference track, represented a significant part of their offering, and putting this in quote unquote the masters or the general meant that there was a significant impact from a financial standpoint as well. And so what's happened since, not to say that we were the cause of this, but the ANA about a year later came out with AIM, and AIM, still embedded within the multicultural track, began to use some of our terminology like total market approach. And so that was for me, that was a win. But at the same time, I think it does misrepresent the original intent as to how do you drive innovation within the industry to reflect this new majority marketplace where minorities are the majority from a demographic standpoint. And so, flash forward, the book came out, and I would consider it to be really the first how-to playbook as to how do you build inclusive customer experiences using insight, cross-cultural, polycultural, meaning, 4 out of the 5 phases of culture based on social science. And so we went through that journey, and I'm so grateful that you came on the journey, and as well as MetLife at that particular time, because I like to say we kind of, took a scientific approach, meaning we had hypotheses. We introduced a piece of thinking in terms of the white paper in 2010. We went out, we did experiments in terms of, some people went around the wheel in terms of the 6 steps. Some people did 1 or 2, but you guys were one of the first ones, you and IKEA, and then obviously British Airways were the ones that went fully around and fully committed. And so when we would face with adversity in terms of challenging the total market approach to inclusive customer experience design, I think P&G, General Mills with the cereal commercial came out, but a lot of the brands retracted and went back to traditional general market and multicultural, because what I like to say today, it's a change management approach. Yes, you can accelerate growth, but it does require as much as an organizational shift and change than it is just a marketing outcome in terms of helping you grow more share. And so, wanted to include this story in terms of how we, the beginning, middle, and end. And I'll say the thing that we introduce after that experience is an assessment tool, because in some cases, that assessment tool is a maturity model. We introduced a culture maturity assessment that helps brands understand the level of change readiness. And we didn't have that. And, when I was at Ogilvy, with Ogilvy Culture, and the reason that's important is because you really get to assess, do they really first want to start with the organizational alignment? Do they want to actually, change experiences from a customer standpoint in terms of redesigning? And once you have that, do they really want to scale and sustain that change that's required? And so throughout that journey, I think we've been able to, make an impact while also providing a new approach to solving for a decades-old problem as it relates to inclusive change and growth. You played a significant part in that. I want to thank you for being a guest today. Anything else you'd like to share before we sign off?
Well, a few things just quickly to touch on. And the Cheerios commercial is, I think, the one you were referring to. Yeah. With the African-American father and the white mother and the child. And the British Airways case, I actually use that in my teaching, just so you know, just because it's a brilliant example of really understanding targeting, the key motivating factor, and then, kind of executing against that. But I do want to just point out that in many ways, Jeffrey, the total market approach that you developed was ahead of its time, not in terms of the market opportunity, but in terms of the way people were thinking about it. And if you fast forward now 10 plus years, right, there are commercials in Spanish that run on English language broadcast networks. And it's gotten to the point where nobody thinks otherwise. I don't speak Spanish, so I don't understand them, but they're running. I would say that diversity in casting has gone to such an extent that it seems like the world is filled with multi-ethnic friendships, in virtually every commercial. And, obviously LGBTQ and different types of family structures have become sort of commonplace in terms of the way it's portrayed. But what's fascinating to me, and we're just coming on the heels of an election, is the role that identity politics is playing much less of a role than was perceived 10 or 15 years ago. When you have a majority of Hispanic Americans voting for Republican candidate, now president-elect, who is specifically against immigration and talking very tough about many different Hispanic markets and Hispanic people in general, when you have 20% of African-American males voting for him, despite, kind of a history of him making incendiary comments and supporting groups and people who are against that particular ethnic group. people are going beyond what the person looks like to the connection that they have with that person.
Yep.
And I think, I believe a majority of white women voted for a male president rather than the female candidate for president. So when you look at that, it is just reinforcing this idea that the total market and connecting on an emotional level on something that crosses ethnic boundaries is now much more obvious than maybe it was at the time. All the decisions that we made at MetLife were data-based. They really were. We did a ton of research. We did a ton of testing, both on creative, on messaging, on figuring out the pain points for consumers and figuring out what hooks we get them to buy a product that, as I mentioned at the beginning, most people never really want to buy.
Yeah.
So all of that is what informed the activities that we did. To me, not pursuing the total market strategy really doesn't make any sense. And the fact that it's now going to be a majority minority market, in fact, it already is in many segments, almost is irrelevant, because the fact is that is the nature of this population. It has truly become a melting pot. And with that, the color of your skin does not necessarily inform what's an important priority to you. I don't think it ever did, but it's certainly, the data shows that it's not doing it now, if that makes sense.
Lewis, we could do a whole nother episode. No, look, I want to, thank you for your bravery and your courage. And I'm aligned with you. And I think it's, when you talk about it from a political, in terms of, every election, it's a validation point in terms of the thinking, all the way from Obama to now. And I do think what continues to surprise, to your point, what from a political and that industry, they're calling it identity, in marketing, we call it ethnic marketing. I do think, because of so many mediums in terms of how people consume content, that it's incumbent upon brands, political organizations, we're for hire, should you need us, that polling is post, whereas if you actually do the research to get the insight, you're going to have a much more impactful. And we know through the work that we've been doing for many decades, you take the life insurance category, 70 plus years old, right? And for the first time, specifically in this case, they actually had primary data for Black, Hispanic, and Asians. And so when you think about what just happened, the question I would ask, did these political organizations actually have primary data for the people beyond identity and really into insight? And I think that's going to continue to be the question when you think from an identity or from an ethnic standpoint. You think they're going to think in a monolithic way, and it doesn't oftentimes turn out to be the case, that these organizations are going to have to do the investment that you guys were able to do and get the impact from a predictability standpoint. So thank you for continuing to advocate and support us, Lewis. And you guys are in the book. If you haven't purchased a copy of the book, Reframe the Marketplace, The Total Market Approach to the New Majority, please go to jeffreylbowman.com. And Lewis, we thank you, and we continue to move onward and upwards.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you very much for creating this opportunity. I think what you've done is going to have an impact on the way people do marketing for many, many years to come. So thank you for your bravery in coming up with this.
Thank you.